Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was a quiet Sunday evening when I decided to take a drive through the old deserted countryside. I didn't have a specific destination in mind, just the open road and the fading light of the sun dipping beneath the horizon. The trees lining the road swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows that stretched across the cracked pavement. I loved these kinds of trips, especially when everything felt so still. The world seemed smaller out here, as though it had been untouched by time. But as the sun set and the last bit of daylight faded, I began to feel that familiar unease creep in. The road was narrow, winding through endless fields on either side. Occasionally, a farmhouse would come into view, but they were all dark and lifeless. As the miles stretched on, I found myself longing for a sign of life, anything to break the silence. The radio was silent, no stations picking up, and my phone had no signal. I was completely alone. It was about halfway through my journey when I spotted something strange off to the side of the road. A figure standing by a mailbox completely still. At first, I thought maybe someone was waiting for a ride or walking back from a long walk. But as I got closer, something didn't feel right. I slowed my car, my eyes narrowing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, like a statue carved from stone. It wasn't until I passed that I realized something even more unsettling. There was no house behind it. No house. Just an empty field that stretched on forever. I instinctively glanced in my rearview mirror, but the figure was gone. I didn't stop to think about it too long. Maybe my mind was playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I told myself it was the isolation, the quiet, making me paranoid. But as I drove further, the same sensation returned. It was like I wasn't alone. Every curve of the road, every shadow cast by the trees felt darker than it should. I couldn't shake the idea that someone, or something, was watching me. I reached for my phone again, hoping for even the slightest signal. Nothing. My stomach tightened as I clenched the steering wheel. The road felt endless, and with every passing mile, that growing sense of unease dug deeper into me. It wasn't until I rounded a bend that I saw it, a figure standing directly in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing against the pavement. My headlights illuminated it, and I could see the outline clearly. It wasn't human. The shape was tall, much taller than any person should be. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, long, and its head tilted at a strange angle. It didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the road. My breath hitched, and I couldn't bring myself to look away. I knew I couldn't drive past it. I wasn't sure if I even could. My foot hovered over the brake, but the figure remained unmoving. It was as if it was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I sat there, frozen, until the silence became deafening. The air felt heavy, almost as if the very space around me had grown colder. My hands trembled on the wheel, and I realized I couldn't look away. It was like I was in a trance, my mind screaming to do something, anything, but my body refused to respond. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take the tension any longer, the figure moved, not forward, but upward. Its limbs stretched even more, reaching far above the car. And then, as if sensing my panic, it began to turn its head, slowly, as if observing me with curiosity. Its eyes, if it had any, seemed to pierce through the windshield. The next few moments felt like they stretched on forever, but then I did something I've never done before. I floored the gas pedal. My car roared to life, and I sped past the figure, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of it, still standing, still watching. But there was no fear on its face. Just a quiet, hollow gaze, as it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station much further down the road, where I finally managed to get a signal. I called my friends, my voice shaky as I told them what happened. They didn't believe me. How could they? Even now, I don't think I fully understand what I saw. But one thing is certain. I never drove through that part of the countryside again, and I doubt I ever will. I'll never forget the day I visited that old bookstore. It was tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by tall, crumbling brick buildings that leaned toward one another as though the city had forgotten about them. The windows of the bookstore were dusty and covered in fog, but something about it drew me in. It wasn't the kind of place people normally wandered into, but I found myself stepping through the creaking wooden door without hesitation. The bell above rang faintly, and the smell of old paper and dust hit me all at once. The place felt as though it had been untouched for decades. Bookshelves stretched high above my head, the spines old and faded. The light from the single bulb overhead flickered weakly. I wandered through the narrow aisles, trailing my fingers along the spines of the forgotten books, half expecting to hear the whispers of some long-lost ghostly stories. I picked up a few, old paperbacks, flipping through pages that crinkled in my hands. Something about the silence and the musty air felt almost otherworldly. I lost track of time, losing myself in the thick atmosphere of the store. At the end of one aisle, I found a shelf that seemed different from the rest. The books here were thinner, almost like pamphlets, their covers dark and worn. I pulled one from the shelf. Its title was barely legible, Whispers of the Forgotten. It wasn't the title that caught my attention, though. It was the strange sense of familiarity I felt as I opened it. The first few pages were scattered with strange symbols and text I couldn't read. I traced my fingers over them, my mind drawn to the obscure illustrations, twisted, distorted shapes that looked like they were from another world. I turned to the next page, and that's when I saw it. Words written in a language that wasn't English. They weren't letters, just strange symbols that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't stop reading, as though something was compelling me to continue. My hands trembled as I read the first few lines. Those who seek will find, but they may not return. The words sent a cold wave through my body. I glanced around the bookstore, suddenly realizing how quiet it had become. The faint creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder than it should have, and I could feel eyes on me. It was as though the store itself was watching, waiting. The room seemed darker now, shadows stretching toward me from the corners of the shelves. My heart raced as I looked back at the book. The pages turned by themselves, landing on a chapter that spoke of places that no longer existed. Forgotten towns, cities swallowed by time and silence. The more I read, the more I felt an odd connection to these places. It was as if I had been there before, even though I knew I hadn't. Suddenly, the light overhead flickered violently, casting everything into near darkness. A chill swept through the room, and I heard a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Turn back." I froze, the whisper echoing in my ears. My eyes darted around the bookstore, but there was no one there. My breath came in shallow gasps. As I realized, I was alone. The pages of the book flipped again, this time stopping on a section titled The Forgotten Path. My hands were shaking as I read, "The path is long and lonely, but those who seek will find. Beware, for what is lost may never be reclaimed." The room felt colder now, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, though no one was there. The air was thick, and it felt as though something was closing in on me. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my mind consumed by the words of the book. It was then that I noticed something at the edge of my vision. A figure, tall, shadowy, and indistinct, stood at the end of the aisle, watching me. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Return." What is lost? Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out. I stumbled backward, clutching the book tightly. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze following me as I hurried toward the door. As I ran out of the bookstore, the bell above rang once more, echoing into the night. I didn't look back. The streets outside were empty, silent, as though the city had swallowed the bookstore whole. I don't know what I brought with me from that place, but every night since I've dreamed of the figures and the whispers. There's a piece of that book still in my hands, and I wonder, will I ever be able to forget, or will I be drawn back seeking something I might not want to find? It was a typical evening trip through the old countryside, nothing unusual about it. My family and I had decided to take a detour from our usual route, exploring some back roads we hadn't traveled before. The sun had long since set, leaving the world bathed in an eerie twilight. The drive was peaceful at first, the only sounds being the hum of the tires and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. The road wound through dense woods, the trees crowding close on either side, their shadows stretching endlessly. There was no one else around, no cars, no other signs of life. As we rounded a bend, something caught my attention. Faint glimmers in the distance. At first, I thought it was just some old reflectors marking the edge of the road, but they didn't seem to align with the typical placement. They were too frequent and too strange. "What are those?" I asked, pointing out. "The window." My parents exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain. "Must be some sort of marker," my dad said, though his voice was unsure. As we drew closer, I realized they weren't markers at all. They were eyes, hundreds of them, glowing faintly in the dark, peering out from the trees along the side of the road. They blinked slowly, as if studying us, their pale light casting distorted shadows that flickered and danced. I couldn't tear my gaze away from them. There had to be something out there. My heart thudded as we drove past, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The road stretched ahead, but the trees grew even denser, their shadows swallowing up any sign of the sky. "Did you see that?" my sister asked, her voice trembling. "I saw it," I replied, my throat dry. We hadn't gone more than a few miles when we spotted something else, small figures, barely visible, darting through the trees. They weren't human, I could tell that much. Not by the way they moved, not by their unnatural speed. It was as though they were lurking, waiting just beyond the edge of visibility. My parents kept driving, trying to stay calm, but the tension in the car was unbearable. We didn't speak much after that, too afraid to acknowledge what we were seeing. Then came the sound, soft, distant whispers carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as we slowed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't speaking words, not any language I recognized, but there was something deeply unsettling about them, like they were murmuring secrets only we were meant to hear. I leaned forward, trying to hear more, but the voices seemed to come from everywhere, as if they were surrounding us. The trees were alive, swaying gently as though they too were listening. The whispers filled the car, weaving into my thoughts, making me doubt my own sanity. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we need to get out of here." My mom didn't answer. She was gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. My dad's knuckles were white too, and his face was pale, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a figure standing by the side of the road. It was tall, emaciated, with long spindly limbs and a distorted, shadowy face that shifted and contorted as if in agony. The thing didn't move, just stood there, staring at us with those hollow, glowing eyes. My breath caught in my throat, and I realized I couldn't look away. The figure began to step forward, its limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. Behind it, others appeared, like specters emerging from the forest, each one more twisted than the last. I could feel my parents slowing the car, but none of us spoke. The world outside was a living nightmare. Trees swaying, shadows dancing, and those glowing eyes everywhere. As the figures drew closer, I saw something in their eyes. An emptiness, a hunger. They weren't after us for harm, I realized. No, they didn't need to hurt us. They wanted something more. They wanted to consume our fear. We didn't stop the car, but we didn't speed up either. There was nothing we could do but drive through the nightmare, hoping that if we didn't provoke them, they'd let us pass. And somehow, they did. When we reached the end of that road, the figures had vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence of the woods. We didn't talk about it. We couldn't. None of us wanted to acknowledge what had happened, as though admitting it might make it real again. To this day, we haven't returned to those back roads, and I'm not sure I ever will. The eyes are still out there, waiting, always watching. It was a late afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore the old lighthouse by the coast. We had always known about it, a crumbling structure perched on the edge of the cliffs, long since abandoned. No one had used it in years, and the stories about its eerie past were the kind that had always fascinated us. The locals whispered of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances, but we weren't ones to believe in ghosts or urban legends. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the rocky coastline as we made our way down the worn trail. The lighthouse stood tall against the darkening sky, its once white walls now faded and streaked with age. The air was thick with salt, and the distant crash of waves echoed around us. Inside the lighthouse, the light was dim, flickering as though it hadn't been used in decades. We made our way up the narrow, creaking staircase, each step accompanied by a low groan of old wood. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out endlessly before us, the horizon blending into the sky. As we explored, the atmosphere grew heavier. The deeper we went into the lighthouse, the quieter it became. It was as if the building itself had swallowed the sounds of the outside world. We tried to brush off the creeping unease that settled over us. After all, old buildings had their quirks, right? That's when we found the door. It was at the back of the top floor, tucked into the corner of what should have been an empty room. The door wasn't locked, but it felt wrong to even touch it. It stood slightly ajar, as though someone had just stepped through and never returned. We hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Something about the air felt thick, oppressive. Still, curiosity won out. I stepped forward and pushed the door open, the sound of rusted hinges echoing in the silence. Beyond the door was a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a flickering bulb that buzzed faintly. It led down into the bowels of the lighthouse, toward the basement. Without saying a word, we started down the hall, the distant rumble of the ocean growing louder as we descended. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were damp, and the floor uneven, scattered with debris. At the bottom of the staircase was another door, this one sealed with rusted metal hinges. There was no light, no indication of what lay beyond. One of my friends reached out, slowly turning the knob. It screeched open, and we were hit with a blast of stale, musty air. The room beyond was in complete darkness. We fumbled for our flashlights illuminating the space before us. The room was vast and cavernous, filled with old, broken furniture and scattered bits of debris. But it wasn't what was in the room that made us freeze. It was what wasn't there. The floor was covered in footprints, small, barefoot prints that seemed to have formed in the dust, leading toward the center of the room. Some were fresh, as if they had been made recently. We followed the trail cautiously, the soft beams of our flashlights shaking in our hands. The prints led us to a pile of old crates in the corner. Beneath them, another door stood ajar, this one almost hidden by the debris. Without thinking, one of us pushed it open. The room beyond was even darker. Our flashlights barely penetrated the blackness, but I could see shapes, shadows shifting just beyond the edge of the light. My breath caught as the feeling of being watched became too overwhelming to ignore. Then, from somewhere deep within the darkness, we heard it. A soft whisper. It was distant at first, like the echo of a voice from a dream. But as we stood there, frozen, the whisper grew louder, clearer. "Let us out." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Let us out. Let us out." The fear in my chest was unbearable, but we had to get out. We backed away from the door, our flashlights now shaking uncontrollably. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the entire room, surrounding us from every direction. And then, silence. We stood there, listening, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing came. The whispers were gone. Slowly, we made our way back up the stairs, hearts pounding in our ears. The feeling of being watched lingered long after we left the lighthouse behind, as though whatever was down there wasn't finished with us. To this day, I can't forget the sound of those whispers. The ones that promised we hadn't seen the last of them. It started during the drive home. My family had been on a long road trip, no set destination, just miles of open highway. It was supposed to be relaxing, a way to escape the monotony of everyday life. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty roads. The car was quiet, just the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets outside. We were nearly home when the first strange thing happened. I was sitting in the back seat, staring out the window, lost in thought, when I saw something move in the corner of my eye. It wasn't something outside, though. Inside the car. A faint shimmer, like someone standing just outside my window, but inside the car. My stomach twisted. I turned to look, but there was nothing. Just the empty highway and my family. "Did you see that?" I asked my parents, my voice shaky. "See what?" My dad replied, his eyes still on the road. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but the sensation of being watched didn't leave. The sun had set completely by then, leaving just the pale glow of the headlights cutting through the darkness. I could feel the tension rising, my heart pounding harder as the landscape sped by. The next time I noticed it, it was more persistent. I couldn't see anything out the windows, but I could feel it. Eyes on me, eyes inside the car. It was like something had slipped into the back seat with me. I turned around, but again, nothing. I was just about to ask my parents if they felt it too when I heard a faint whisper, so quiet I almost convinced myself it was just the wind. But then, louder, clearer. "Look behind you." I froze. My breath hitched and I gripped the edge of the seat. I turned slowly, my eyes wide, expecting to see something, anything. There was nothing. The empty back seat stared back at me. "What's wrong?" my mom asked, her voice full of concern. I tried to shrug it off, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something, or someone, was there, just behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a figure, but the car was still empty. Then it happened again. Another whisper, soft, but now unmistakable. "Look again." I didn't want to look. My body trembled, but curiosity and fear battled in my mind. I slowly turned, expecting to see that distorted reflection in the rearview mirror, or maybe a figure in the shadows, but there was nothing, only the dark, empty highway stretching into the distance. "Please, stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My parents were still talking up front, oblivious to my panic. I felt trapped, unable to escape whatever was following me. A third whisper came, closer this time, as though it was right in my ear. "Turn around." I couldn't resist anymore. My head snapped back, eyes wide, searching the dark space behind me. And that's when I saw it. The faintest movement, a shadow, shifting in the seat next to me. It wasn't human, not exactly. Its form was blurry, almost liquid-like, blending with the dark. It was there, watching me. My breath hitched as I stared, my mind screaming for me to look away, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to look anywhere else but at the figure. It shifted again, leaning closer. Its presence felt like a cold wind pressing against my skin. "Don't look," it whispered again, but this time I knew I couldn't turn away. Tears welled in my eyes as I forced myself to look forward, staring out at the dark road ahead. The whispers stopped, and the sensation of being watched faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking in the shadows of my mind. When we finally reached home, I didn't say a word. I wasn't sure if I could explain what I had seen, or if they would even believe me. But every time I close my eyes, I can still feel it. The whisper in my ear, the eyes that followed me, the shadow sitting right beside me, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple day at the park, nothing unusual. Just me, my camera, and a quiet trail leading into the woods. I've always been fond of nature and spent my weekends hiking or exploring different paths, searching for something unique to capture on film. That morning, I packed my camera gear and set out early. The air was crisp and the sun was barely peeking over the horizon when I arrived at the trailhead. It was a familiar spot, but this time something felt off. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves were missing. Instead, there was silence, the kind that hangs heavy, as if the world itself had gone still. I took a deep breath and shrugged it off, telling myself I was imagining things. As I followed the trail deeper into the woods, the quiet only grew. The trees seemed taller, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The path became narrower, winding between thick undergrowth. I kept walking, ignoring the unease growing in my chest. At one point, I stopped to take a photo. I raised my camera and glanced through the lens. What I saw wasn't the usual forest scene. There was something there, something moving just beyond, the edge of the frame. A figure, tall and obscured by the trees, watching me. My hands shook as I lowered the camera, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I kept moving, trying to push the thought away, but every step felt heavier. The weak trail began to thin, and the trees loomed larger, as if they were closing in on me. I glanced behind, but all I could see was the empty path I had come from. I walked until I reached a small clearing, bathed in the dim light filtering through the canopy. It was peaceful, the kind of moment you wish could last forever. But something about the stillness unsettled me. I felt like I was being watched. I set my camera down on a rock and took a seat, staring at the trees that surrounded me. Then I noticed something. A faint whisper, almost inaudible. I strained my ears, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just the wind, until it came again, louder this time. Not quite a whisper, not quite a voice, but something close enough to make my skin crawl. I grabbed my camera and began to snap pictures, hoping to capture whatever it was. The shutter clicked again and again, but when I reviewed the images, there was nothing but the forest. A rustling noise came from behind, and I turned sharply, expecting to see an animal. Instead, there was nothing, just the trees, still and unmoving. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was alone. Or so I thought. I heard it again, closer this time, the faint sound of footsteps crunching leaves. I turned slowly, my camera raised, but there was still nothing in sight. The sound continued, steady and deliberate, circling the clearing. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps weren't from an animal. They were from something else. I stumbled backward, keeping my eyes on the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, moving between the trees. Its form was distorted, barely human, but I could feel its presence. Its eyes, if it even had them, were black voids, staring straight at me. I turned and ran. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, the sound of those footsteps growing louder behind me. The trees blurred into streaks of green and brown, but I didn't dare stop. My camera swung wildly as I pushed through thorns and branches, the fear coursing through me like electricity. When I finally broke free from the trees, I didn't stop to look back. I ran to my car, throwing open the door and slamming it shut. Behind me, the silence of the forest was replaced by the steady hum of the engine, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I sat there, hands trembling on the steering wheel, staring at the woods. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared, but I knew it was still out there, waiting just beyond my sight. It was the kind of summer evening where the air feels thick, almost suffocating. My friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned amusement park that was rumored to be haunted. The place had been closed for decades, forgotten, overgrown, and left to rot. We weren't really sure what we expected to find, but the idea of exploring something so eerie felt like the perfect escape from the humdrum of our usual lives. As we parked near the entrance, the silence was oppressive. The old, rusted gates groaned as we pushed them open, the metal scraping against itself. The ground was uneven beneath our feet, with weeds and tall grass creeping up through the cracks in the concrete. It felt as though time had stopped. We walked through the overgrown pathways, stepping carefully to avoid the broken glass and twisted remnants of rides that once filled this place with laughter. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its rusted frame creaking in the faint breeze. We weren't exactly sure what we were hoping to find, but the air was thick with a strange tension that made my skin crawl. As we ventured deeper into the park, the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Shadows stretched long and distorted, casting unsettling shapes on the decaying attractions. The further we went, the quieter it became. The sounds of birds and wind seemed to fade away, leaving only the echo of our own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Then came the first sign that something wasn't right. We came across the old carousel. The once bright-painted horses were now faded and covered in moss. We stopped in front of it, the air suddenly feeling colder. I could see my breath in the dim light. Something felt off. I had this overwhelming sensation that we weren't alone. Noticed a strange figure standing by the far side of the carousel, just beyond the broken tracks. It was tall, too tall, with a gaunt, skeletal frame that seemed unnaturally elongated. The figure didn't move, just stood there, facing us with its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look." They turned, following my gaze. At first, they didn't see it, but when they did, they froze. The figure stood still, its hollow black eyes staring at us. There was no face, just a void where its features should have been. It didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice shaking. We turned to run, but as we did, there was a sudden, sharp sound behind us. The slow creak of the carousel. I dared to look back, and there it was, moving. The horses spun, but there was no sound, just the grotesque image of the figure standing there, watching us. We ran, pushing through the undergrowth, desperate to get back to the car. The park seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around us. Every time I looked back, I could see the figure, always there, always watching. When we finally stumbled out onto the road, we didn't stop running until we reached town. The park faded, behind us, swallowed by darkness. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. It was a late autumn evening when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to an old, abandoned lighthouse on the edge of the coast. None of us had ever been there, and the place had always been rumored to be haunted. Skeptical, as we all were, we figured it would make for an eerie, atmospheric adventure. The lighthouse stood tall against the backdrop of a dark, churning sea. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of an old wooden pier as we parked the car a few miles down the narrow, winding road. The air was heavy with mist and the salty tang of the ocean. We all felt the shift in the atmosphere as we stepped out of the car, the warmth of the day fading fast. As we approached the base of the lighthouse, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if the darkness itself was watching us. The structure loomed in front of us, its once pristine white paint now weathered and peeling. The steps spiraled upwards into the sky, vanishing into the dense fog that had rolled in. "We'll split up," Matt said, his voice breaking the silence. "That way, we cover more ground. One of us can check out the bottom while the rest go up." Against my better judgment, we agreed. I could feel the weight of the ancient stone beneath my feet as I started climbing, the sounds of my friend's footsteps fading below. Each creaking step seemed louder than the last, the wind growing stronger as I ascended. The higher I climbed, the colder the air became. I paused, turning back to glance at the fog that now swallowed the ground below. My heart pounded in my chest. It was so quiet, except for the sound of my own breath and the faint echo of the wind. When I finally reached the top, I pushed open the rusted door, stepping into the narrow space of the lighthouse. The view from the top was breathtaking. Mist rolling in every direction, the sea stretching out beyond the horizon, waves crashing against the rocks below. But something wasn't right. The air felt thick, as if it had a weight of its own. The sound of the wind was different now, more oppressive, as if it carried something more than just the chill of the ocean. I turned to scan the interior of the lighthouse, its walls lined with faded photographs of sailors and their families, some so old they were barely recognizable. That's when I saw it. The figure. It was standing by the window, its shape barely distinguishable from the fog. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw its outline, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared right through me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body felt frozen as the figure turned, slightly, facing me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It remained still, like a ghostly silhouette against the window. The wind howled louder, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket. My legs trembled as I slowly backed away, my hand gripping the cold metal railing. Suddenly, I heard voices below. "Guys, where are you?" It was Matt, his voice frantic. "Come on, we need to get out of here." "Matt," I yelled, panic rising in my throat. "There's something up here." Before I could react, the figure began to move, floating towards me with unnatural grace. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the narrow stairs. I could feel the presence closing in, the figure growing larger with every step I took down. When I finally reached the bottom, my friends were waiting, eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I saw it," I managed to say, breathless. "It was up there, watching me." The rest of the night passed in silence. We didn't speak much as we packed up and left the lighthouse behind. The figure, whatever it was, haunted my thoughts, its hollow gaze etched in my mind. I still don't know what I saw that night, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, I find myself staring out into the fog, half expecting to see those hollow eyes watching from the distance. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip. A few friends and I decided to escape the city and spend a weekend camping at a secluded lake in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but we'd heard it was quiet, beautiful, and perfect for getting away from the noise of the world. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the trees as we parked our cars by the edge of the lake. The water was calm, its surface reflecting the pale light of dusk like a mirror. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For a moment, everything felt perfect. We set up our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked dinner. The laughter and conversation filled the space, muffled by the stillness of the woods. It was everything we had hoped for: peaceful, remote, and disconnected from the chaos of daily life. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, watching the flames flicker and listening to the quiet crackling. The stars appeared, one by one, stretching out into the endless dark sky. The lake reflected them, making it seem as though we were surrounded by an ocean of light. But it wasn't the beauty that started to unsettle me. It was the silence. No wind rustled the trees. No insects chirped, just the crackling fire and the faint sound of water lapping at the shore. It was too quiet, unnatural. I glanced around at my friends who were deep in conversation, unaware of the strange stillness. "I'm going to get some water," one of them finally said, breaking the silence. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "I'll come with." We made our way to the edge of the lake, our footsteps silent on the soft earth. The water was cold and still, reflecting the dark shapes of the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. "Hey," I whispered to my friend. "Do you feel that?" He stopped, looking at me, his face pale under the starlight. "Yeah, something's not right." We stood there for a moment, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. There was no movement, no sound, just the stillness. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint shimmer, like something just beneath the surface of the water. A reflection that wasn't quite right. I turned toward it, heart racing, and saw a figure. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its form was indistinct, almost fluid, as though it was made of the water itself. It stared at us with hollow eyes, its face obscured by the darkness. I grabbed my friend's arm, my voice trembling. "We need to get back." We ran. Our footsteps thundered in my ears as we sprinted back to the campsite. The trees loomed over us, their branches creaking as if they were watching us too. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows on my friends' faces, but none of them seemed to notice our panic. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I kept hearing whispers in the dark, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the figure, those hollow, watching eyes beneath the water. At dawn, I gathered my friends and told them what had happened. They didn't believe me. They dismissed it as nerves, as the strange atmosphere of the woods playing tricks on my mind. But I knew better. The figure was still out there, waiting beneath the surface of the lake, and I could still feel those hollow eyes watching me, even now. It was a quiet afternoon when my friends and I decided to visit a secluded beach. The sun was high in the sky, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was the only thing breaking the silence. We had heard about this beach from someone who had described it as peaceful, remote, and the perfect place to escape from the noise of the world. We loaded up the car and drove for hours, leaving the familiar city behind. The drive was long, but the scenery changed from bustling streets to endless fields and towering cliffs as we got further from civilization. By the time we parked, we were surrounded by nothing but sand, sea, and the distant cries of seagulls. The beach was stunning. The sand stretched out in front of us, seemingly untouched by human footsteps. The waves crashed gently, and the smell of salt water filled the air. We set up camp, unpacked our things, and made a small fire to cook some food. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the beach, and we relaxed, enjoying the quiet. But something felt off. It wasn't the usual peace you'd expect from a place like this. It was more than just solitude. There was a strange stillness, almost like the world had stopped breathing. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the quiet of being far from everything. As the sun set, casting brilliant orange and pink hues across the horizon, we heard something strange, a faint, muffled sound, almost like faint whispers carried by the breeze. We exchanged glances, but none of us said anything at first. Maybe it was just the wind, we told ourselves, but the whispers didn't go away. The darkness fell quickly after the sun disappeared, and that's when things got weirder. We were sitting by the fire talking quietly when a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. It looked like a man, but there was something wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though its bones were bending the wrong way. We all froze, unable to look away as the figure walked toward us, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The whispers became clearer now, but they weren't words. They were like a low, guttural sound, almost a chant. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound that we could understand. It just kept coming, step by step, dragging one foot behind the other. Panic set in, but none of us could move. We watched, unable to look away as the figure came closer. The sound of the waves grew louder, but the figure didn't stop. It was getting closer to the edge of the firelight, and I could see its face, if you could even call it that. Its skin was stretched too tight, as if it had been stretched thin like old paper, with hollow sunken eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, staring at us with those lifeless black eyes. The whispers grew louder, almost a wail now, and the wind howled. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it turned and walked back into the darkness, vanishing into the shadows without a trace. We were too afraid to speak, too terrified to move. The fire crackled, and we sat there, shivering in the cold night, listening to the sound of the waves. The whispers had stopped. The figure was gone. We never saw anything else that night, but to this day, I still hear those whispers in my dreams. There was something about that beach, something ancient, something that should have stayed hidden beneath the waves. I was in the middle of a road trip driving through endless stretches of desert. The sun had set hours ago, and now it was just me and the empty highway. There wasn't a single car in sight, nothing but the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone. I had been driving for what felt like forever, searching for the next gas station or even a small town, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the horizon like a thin line against the sky. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and the only sound in the car was the steady hum of the engine. I was starting to feel uneasy. Everything about this trip had felt off since the moment I left. The air was dry and still, not a whisper of wind or even the faintest rustle of leaves. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The low fuel light blinked on, warning me that I needed to find something soon. My eyes searched the horizon, hoping for a sign of life, a flicker of light, anything. But the desert was vast and empty, stretching out in all directions. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally saw something. In the distance, a faint glow of light, maybe a gas station or a motel. I couldn't tell which from this far away. But hope surged through me, and I pushed my foot down harder on the gas pedal. As I got closer, the light became clearer. It wasn't a gas station or a motel. It was a building, old and crumbling, its walls covered in cracked paint. A small, flickering sign hung above the entrance, barely legible in the fading light. It read, "The Oasis." My stomach twisted. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But at this point, I didn't care. I needed fuel, water, something, anything to keep going. I parked my car in front of the building and stepped out, the heat still radiating off the pavement. The air smelled dry and dusty, the kind of scent that clings to your throat. The front door creaked open as I pushed it. Inside, it was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs dangling from the ceiling. The shelves were empty, covered in a thick layer of dust. The coolers were all shut, ice long melted. It felt more like a ghost town than a place meant to serve travelers. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the silence. No reply. I moved through the aisles, hoping to find a supply of water or something to drink. but there was nothing. The only sound was my footsteps echoing against the cracked tile floor. It was eerie. The silence felt oppressive, as if the desert had swallowed up everything, leaving only this empty space behind. I made my way to the back of the store, where an old counter sat, covered in cobwebs. A small radio sat there, its antenna bent, dust coating its surface. I picked it up, hoping maybe I could get some signal, but static hissed from the speaker. Nothing but dead air. Desperation started to set in. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. I had no idea how far I was from anything. I was isolated, completely alone in this vast, empty desert. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed from the direction of the front door. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, soft, deliberate, steady. It wasn't the wind. It didn't sound like something natural. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I crept toward the front, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from outside, but somewhere inside the building. I couldn't tell where exactly. It sounded like it was right in front of me, but there was nothing there. I turned to look back at the counter, and that's when I saw it. A dark shape standing behind the glass. It wasn't human. It had no distinct features, just a shadowy, distorted form. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I didn't know how that was possible. My breath hitched as I stepped back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It moved closer, slow, deliberate. I could hear its footsteps, even though they shouldn't have made a sound on the dust-covered floor. I bolted for the door, fear clouding my vision. The creaking footsteps followed me, closer now, as though it was right behind me. I threw open the door and sprinted into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was miles down the road, the building a distant blur behind me. My car waited, humming quietly, the only sound I could hear. I never went back. I don't know what I saw that night or if it was even real, but sometimes, when I drive through the desert, I wonder if I'll see that building again, or if something else will come for me. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to take a solo drive through the countryside. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by trees that were shedding their leaves, casting long, eerie shadows under the fading sunlight. I always enjoyed these quiet drives, just me and the open road, away from the noise of the city. I'd taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. The air was thicker, almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out here. The road wound through rolling hills, with fields stretching far beyond the horizon. I passed a few dilapidated barns, their broken windows reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. It was the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped, silent, isolated, and forgotten. As I drove, the familiar sound of my tires crunching over the gravel faded, replaced by a strange, distant echo, almost like footsteps following behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone. But there was no one, just empty road stretching out behind me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was just my imagination. But as I drove further, the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if someone was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Eventually, I reached an old, overgrown trail leading into the woods. I couldn't help but take a detour, curious about the trees that loomed ahead. The leaves crunched beneath my tires as I ventured deeper into the forest. The air became cooler and the sounds of nature seemed to fade, leaving only silence. The trees stretched high above, their branches forming a dense canopy, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. It felt as if I had stepped into a different world, one untouched by time. I stopped the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp, cool air. The forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The wind whispered through the trees, but there were no birdsong, no rustling of animals, just the stillness of the woods. I wandered off the trail, following a narrow footpath that seemed to beckon me deeper into the forest. Every step felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching, their twisted limbs casting dark shapes on the ground. Then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't distant or echoing. They were close, too close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting. I slowly turned around, expecting to see something, or someone, standing behind me. But there was nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the panic rising in my throat. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own shaky breathing. I clutched my phone tightly, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. I must have been imagining things. It had to be the isolation, the eerie quiet of the woods. I told myself that over and over, but deep down, I knew better. I retraced my steps, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the path harder to see in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but it was dead. My signal had vanished, and I realized just how far I'd strayed from the main road. Panic set in. The feeling of being lost was overwhelming. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. I could feel them behind me, just beyond the edge of my vision. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat. Still, no one. I forced myself to walk faster, the crunching of leaves beneath my feet now sounding like whispers, like the trees themselves were speaking. The woods felt endless, as if they had no intention of letting me go. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto an old, faded trail marker. The letters were barely legible, but I could just make out the word path etched into the wood. I followed the marker, hoping it would lead me back to my car. The silence was deafening, but at least now I had a point of reference. I kept my head down, not wanting to look behind me, where I knew something, or someone, was watching. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw my car waiting in the distance, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. I didn't stop running until I reached it, slamming the door shut behind me. As I drove away, the weight in my chest eased, but the feeling of being followed didn't. I knew I'd be looking over my shoulder for a long time. What had been out there in the woods with me? I still don't know, and I don't think I ever want to find out. It was supposed to be a quiet evening walk through the old park, something I'd done countless times, but that night was different. Something about the air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. The sun had just set, casting the park in an eerie twilight, and as I strolled along the worn path, I noticed the usual sounds of the city had disappeared. No distant traffic hum, no birdsong, just silence. I wasn't far from the entrance when I realized something wasn't right. The atmosphere had changed entirely. The usual chirps of insects muted to nothing. It felt as though the world had stopped. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the cracked pavement, and I turned to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just empty darkness. I picked up my pace, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Shadows stretched long and thin across the path ahead, stretching beyond what was normal, and they seemed to shift unnaturally as though they were alive. My breath quickened, and I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that nothing could possibly be out there. As I reached a bend in the path, I stopped. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too distorted. The face, it wasn't a face, just a void, empty and black. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow sockets that seemed to absorb all the light around them. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen in place as it turned toward me, its movements jerky, like something inhuman trying to mimic the way a person walks. A soft, raspy noise escaped its hollow mouth, a sound that wasn't speech, but something far worse. Terror gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to move. The thing began to advance, each step sending chills down my spine. I could feel its gaze boring into me, but when I tried to look at its face, there was nothing. Just darkness, endless and oppressive. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. The silence stretched, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and began to walk away, its elongated form retreating into the shadows. The sound of its footsteps faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before I found the courage to move. I stumbled back toward the park entrance, never daring to look behind me again. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to find out. To this day, I still walk past that park, but I've never stopped looking over my shoulder. It was supposed to be just a quiet day in the park, like any other. My friends and I decided to visit a local nature reserve, one we had gone to several times before. The plan was simple: take a leisurely stroll through the trails, enjoy the quiet, and maybe spot some wildlife. The reserve was vast, sprawling with dense forests, winding paths, and open meadows. The air was fresh, and apart from the chirping of birds, there wasn't a sound. We had been walking for hours, soaking in the peace, taking turns spotting birds and tracking animal prints. Everything felt normal. Too normal. It was around mid-afternoon when something changed. We took a break by clearing near a small, overgrown pond. My friend Emma bent down to dip her hand into the water, running her fingers through the surface. As she did, there was a faint ripple, and she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all gathered around, following her gaze. The pond looked calm, but there was something strange about it, like the reflection wasn't quite right. The surface of the water didn't ripple naturally. It shifted in unnatural ways, as if there was something beneath the surface, watching us. I had seen enough horror movies to know that something wasn't right, but I tried to push those thoughts away. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though my voice trembled. Emma shook her head. "No, that wasn't wind. It was like something moved under the water." We exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The park had always been peaceful. There was no history of accidents, no reports of strange occurrences. Still, that feeling of unease lingered. We decided to leave the clearing and continue down the trail, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But as we walked further, something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows darker than they should have been. The birdsong had stopped entirely, and there was an eerie silence hanging over the forest. We reached a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. The map we had brought was missing, and no one remembered where we had left it. We stood there for what felt like hours, the tension growing with each passing second. It was Emma who noticed it first. Footprints. They were small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they looked fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They weren't human. They were long, claw-like marks, digging deep into the earth. My stomach twisted as I traced the prints, feeling their unnatural depth. "I don't like this," I muttered. "We should turn back." But none of us could bring ourselves to move. We were frozen in place, staring at the trail that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like something breathing, just beyond the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder, more insistent. My ears strained, trying to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was closer now. Too close. "Run," Emma whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the trail, sprinting through the thick forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The trees blurred as we moved, but no matter how fast we ran, the sound seemed to be right behind us, never fading. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, its eyes hollow and empty. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on us, unrelenting. "We have to go," I yelled, pulling my friends along. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No footprints, no figure, only the trees swaying in the wind. To this day, we have no explanation for what we saw. The reserve was quiet once more, but something had changed. Whatever we encountered in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. We've never returned to that place. I had always loved the quiet of late-night drives, the stillness of the road, the moonlight illuminating the empty stretch ahead. It was the perfect time to think, to be alone with your thoughts. So, one evening, after a long day of work, I decided to take a drive through the countryside. The roads were winding and dark, but the drive itself was soothing. I didn't have a destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and clear my head. The air felt crisp, and I rolled down the windows, letting the cool breeze rush in. As I drove further into the night, the world around me seemed to shrink. The only sounds were the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustling of trees that loomed on either side of the road. I didn't pass another car for miles. It was peaceful in a way that was almost surreal. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was a hitchhiker, but something about the way they stood, unmoving, just watching the road, felt off. They didn't seem to be waiting for a car. They were just there, staring. I slowed down, unsure of what to make of it. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a dark hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart pounded as I drove past, trying to keep my eyes on the road. I didn't dare look back. But I just knew. It was watching me. The rest of the drive was consumed by a growing sense of dread. The peaceful night had become something else entirely. Every creak of the car, every shadow cast by the moon, felt like they were part of something larger. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired and spooked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I reached a small town as dawn began to break. The figure was gone, but I couldn't forget the sense of being watched. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the car keys, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I noticed something strange. My rearview mirror was cracked, as if something had grabbed it. I haven't driven that road since. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out into the hills. We weren't exactly sure where we were going, but that was part of the appeal. Just aimlessly exploring, watching the sunset over the valley, letting the world slip away. The winding road stretched ahead, surrounded by thick woods on either side. We were laughing, joking about nothing in particular, when we came across a narrow dirt path that cut off from the main road. It wasn't marked, barely noticeable, but curiosity got the best of us. "Let's see where it goes," one of my friends said, turning onto the path. The trees grew thicker as we followed the trail, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. The deeper we drove, the quieter it became. The only sound the crunching of gravel beneath the tires. The woods seemed to close in around us, shadows creeping longer as the light faded. After what felt like miles, we came across an old, decrepit cabin. Its roof sagged, windows shattered, and the door hung ajar like something had long since abandoned it. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. We stopped the car and got out, drawn by some strange compulsion. The air was still, heavy with the scent of decay. The cabin stood there, a relic from a forgotten past, like it had been waiting for us to find it. The three of us hesitated, but something about the silence and the sense of isolation pulled us closer. Inside, it was colder than outside. Dust covered everything, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Old furniture lay overturned, forgotten, and broken. It was as though no one had been here in decades. My friends and I moved cautiously, shining our flashlights into the corners of the cabin, peering through the debris. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the floorboards. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the cabin. We froze, our breath catching in our throats. The cabin was small, too small for someone to be hiding. We had checked the whole place, every room, yet those footsteps kept moving, circling us, echoing louder as they drew closer. Panic set in. My friends were shouting, trying to make sense of it, but I was rooted to the spot. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist and bend unnaturally. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its face was obscured by darkness. No eyes, no features, just a void where the face should have been. It moved closer, the footsteps still echoing, but now they were slower, more deliberate. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing didn't seem to notice us, as if we were invisible. It reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against the doorframe, and then it simply disappeared. We didn't stay. We couldn't. My friends and I ran back to the car, not looking back, the silence of the woods pressing down on us as we tore down the path. The strange figure, whatever it was, had vanished, but the fear it left behind lingered, hanging in the air like a bad dream. Even now, I can't forget the stillness of the woods, the hollow echo of those footsteps, and the figure that no one could explain. Some things don't need answers to be terrifying. I never thought a simple trip to the library could go so wrong, but that's exactly what happened. It was a quiet Thursday evening, and I'd gone to return a book I had borrowed earlier in the week. The library was one of those old, sprawling buildings with creaky wooden floors and shelves that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. The place had always felt peaceful during the day, but at night, it transformed into something entirely different. I arrived around 8 p.m., just as the sun was starting to set. The place was empty except for the dim lights glowing faintly from the ceiling. I preferred it like that. No distractions, just the quiet rustling of pages and the creak of old furniture. I found a book I had meant to return and walked toward the front desk. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The door behind the counter, usually locked, was slightly ajar. I paused, unsure. No one had ever left that door open before. It wasn't a staff door either, more of a storage room or maintenance access. I took a step closer and pushed it open just enough to glance inside. It was empty, or so I thought. But there was a smell, something old and musty, like forgotten history. I chalked it up to the building's age and moved on, returning the book. As I walked through the aisles, I noticed how eerily quiet everything was. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the shelves, amplifying the silence. I half expected to hear the distant shuffle of someone else's steps, but there was nothing but my own. It wasn't until I came to the farthest corner of the library that things took a turn. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. My skin crawled, but I told myself it was just the building settling. I'd always liked old libraries, but now something felt off. I continued down the row, heading toward the fiction section, when I saw it. A figure, just a shadow, barely distinguishable from the dim light. It stood still, as if waiting for me. I froze, heart pounding, but something told me to look away. So, I did. It wasn't until I had taken a few more steps that I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps echoing behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. The aisle behind me was empty. I stood there, frozen, my eyes darting between the rows of books. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Then I heard it again, this time, closer. I could feel someone behind me, even though I couldn't see them. My chest tightened and my breath quickened. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the space behind me. Then, a voice, low and hollow, like it was coming from somewhere beyond the shelves. "Who's there?" My stomach dropped. I didn't dare answer. The voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't human either. It was patient, waiting. I felt like something was drawing closer, closer, closer. A sudden crash from deeper inside the library made me jump. I didn't think, just ran. I sprinted toward the entrance, my mind screaming for me to get out. I didn't dare look back. The air seemed thicker as I pushed the front door open, fleeing into the cool night. I didn't stop running until I was home, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that library. To this day, I haven't gone back. I was 13 when it happened, during a summer trip to my grandparents' old farmhouse. It wasn't just any trip, it was supposed to be a simple visit, full of farmland sunsets and lazy afternoons. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The farmhouse itself was isolated, sitting at the edge of an overgrown field, far from any neighboring houses. My parents assured me it was just an old family home, quiet and peaceful. But from the moment I walked in, a strange sense of unease took hold. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of each step, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the silence than it should have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was from outside. At first, I dismissed it as some small animal, maybe a bird or a raccoon, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate as the hours passed. In the morning, I asked my grandmother about the noise. She shrugged, a little smile playing on her lips. "Just the old trees. The wind does strange things out here." But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it either. The days passed, but the tapping never stopped. It wasn't just random anymore. It was constant. I began to hear it even when I was awake, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding fields. They stretched out for miles, untouched by modern life, just the way they had been for decades. The air was thick with the scent of hay and soil. The trees creaked gently as the wind picked up, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I wandered far from the farmhouse until I could no longer see the building. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not far from where I stood, barely visible beneath the branches of a gnarled oak tree. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall, its form distorted as if it didn't belong in the world. I couldn't make out its face, only dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its head, lifeless and empty. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, unmoving, as though waiting for me. Slowly, I raised my hand, and with a trembling finger, I pointed. The figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, silent and endless. The tapping continued. Only now it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It seemed to come from within me, a dull rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something I couldn't understand. I don't know how much time passed before I finally turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had, back toward the farmhouse. The figure never followed. It simply watched, unmoving, as I fled. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the tapping. It was quieter now, but still there, persistent and unrelenting. I realized that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could run from. It had become a part of me. We left the farmhouse the next day, but the tapping never stopped. I can still hear it sometimes, especially in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. It was supposed to be a quiet evening out, just me and a few friends. We decided to explore an old abandoned theater that had been shut down for decades. The place was a relic, decaying with its crumbling facade and faded marquee. The theater had always been known for its eerie history, rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something lurking in the shadows. We weren't expecting much beyond a few creepy sights and maybe some unsettling stories to tell afterward. It wasn't far from town, but far enough that no one really ventured there anymore. The building was dark, with broken windows and faded paint. The sign above the entrance flickered intermittently, creating fleeting glimpses of the name Riverview Theater. We stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting us immediately. Dust hung thick in the air, and the old red velvet seats were tattered and stained. The theater was massive, with a grand stage still intact, though the paint was peeling, revealing layers of once vibrant murals beneath. As we wandered deeper into the building, there was a strange silence. The creaks of the old floorboards echoed around us, amplifying every step we took. The air felt cold, unnatural. I shivered and glanced around, wondering if we'd come too far into a place that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. That's when things started getting strange. We found ourselves in what remained of the lobby. The front doors had long been boarded up, but there was a door behind the counter, leading to the projection room. My friends and I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. I led the way, opening the door slowly. Inside was a long hallway lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with faded, yellowing posters of long-forgotten movies. As we moved down the hall, the floor creaked beneath our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The projection room at the end of the hall was locked. The old rusted door refused to budge no matter how much we pushed. I pulled out my phone to get a better look, and that's when I saw the graffiti etched into the wall. "We're watching you." My blood ran cold, and I realized that whoever wrote that wasn't kidding. I turned around, and that's when I noticed something. A figure, just a faint silhouette, standing at the back of the theater. It was obscured by the shadows, but its presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the figure. The light danced across the shadows, revealing nothing. The figure had vanished. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. We decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as we made our way back to the lobby, the door behind us slammed shut, cutting us off from the exit. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of our breathing echoed in the empty theater, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above, the creaking of footsteps, slow, deliberate. My flashlight caught a glimpse of movement on the balcony. I froze, shining the beam up toward the second level. A figure stood there, staring down at us. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where the eyes should have been. Its silhouette seemed to blur, shifting and stretching in a way that was unnatural. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the main entrance, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The door, however, was still sealed shut. In desperation, I turned back to the balcony, expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something far worse. It wasn't a figure at all. It was a screen, glowing faintly. But the screen wasn't showing any movie. It was showing us. There we were, standing at the front of the theater, faces frozen in horror. But something was wrong. Our reflections weren't acting like we were. The shadows, the empty eyes, they weren't reflections at all. They were watching us, mimicking us. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing when the screen went dark. The theater was plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. My friends and I managed to break free from the building somehow, sprinting into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. The old theater remained behind us, a broken, silent shell under the pale moonlight. We never spoke of what we saw that night, and we never went back. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. The quiet solitude of nature was something I craved, especially after long, stressful weeks. One summer afternoon, I decided to head to a remote trail I'd been eyeing for months. It wasn't marked on most maps, secluded deep in the forest. The trailhead was a dirt path hidden off a narrow road, barely visible to anyone passing by. The hike started as usual. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I reveled in the stillness, lost in the rhythm of my footsteps and the sound of birds overhead. For hours, I trekked through the dense woods, following the winding trail deeper into the forest. The trail eventually began to narrow, the trees pressing in around me. It wasn't long before I realized I'd lost my bearings. I pulled out my map and compass, but neither gave me any clue as to which direction I should go. I sat down on a large rock, trying to collect my thoughts, but the sense of isolation began to creep in. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I wasn't truly lost, just turned around. But as the hours passed and the sunlight dimmed, I started feeling something was wrong. The forest felt heavier. The usual sounds of birds had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie quiet. It was as though the woods themselves had become aware of my presence. I pressed on, my pace quickening, though fear began to seep into my bones. I needed to get out of there. The trail eventually split into two. I didn't know which way to go, so I flipped a coin. Heads. I took the right path. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to loom, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers. The sun had set, leaving the forest in near total darkness. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Shadows danced in the light, appearing as figures just beyond my sight. Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the sound of my own boots against the ground, but something lighter, quicker. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, approaching rapidly, echoing unnaturally close. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response, just the sound of rustling leaves. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, shining it in every direction. The forest felt alive now, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. I took off running, but the footsteps followed, always just behind me. I could hear them breathing, ragged and shallow, as though the thing was right on my heels. I didn't dare look back, but I knew whatever it wasn't human. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the trees bending and creaking with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. Exhausted, I collapsed against a tree, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell deathly quiet again. I could feel something watching me, something I couldn't see, yet I knew it was there, standing just beyond my sight. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the trees. The world around me seemed to blur, and then, in the dim light, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it wasn't human. Its presence radiated something cold, something inhuman. Tears streamed down my face as I turned and ran. The woods stretched endlessly, the path disappearing beneath my feet. I could hear it again, the sound of footsteps, lighter now but unmistakably close. And then, through the haze, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of my flashlight's beam, I glimpsed something hanging from a tree, faint and twisted in the darkness. A figure, a face. It wasn't human, not anymore, just a hollow, warped shape that hung from the tree, swaying gently in the wind. I screamed and ran faster, but I knew it was always right behind me. I didn't stop, couldn't stop, until I burst out of the forest and stumbled into the light of day, gasping for air. I made it out, but even now, I can still feel it, watching, waiting, in the dark, just beyond the edge of sight. It was late spring when I decided to take a trip to the old lighthouse. Located on a rocky outcrop overlooking the coast, it wasn't a place people visited often. Most locals whispered about how the lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and doors rusted shut. Despite the warnings, I always had a fascination with places like this, forgotten, isolated, and steeped in mystery. I parked my car at the edge of the cliff and climbed over the low fence that marked the entrance. The air was salty and thick with the smell of the ocean. The lighthouse stood tall against the gray sky, its worn brick exterior covered in moss. It was both haunting and beautiful in the fading light. I pushed open the creaking metal door at the base of the structure and stepped inside. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness, so I pulled out a flashlight from my backpack. The beam flickered, casting shaky light against the old stone walls as I made my way up. Each step echoed around me, amplifying the silence. It felt as though the place had been waiting for me, abandoned and forgotten. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the air became, growing colder with each passing floor. By the time I reached the top, I was surrounded by the familiar smell of dust and decay. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out before me, waves crashing against the cliffs below. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude, the silence. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the vastness of it all. But then I noticed something strange. In the distance, along the jagged coastline, there was movement. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I watched, it became clearer. A figure silhouetted against the horizon. They were standing there, unmoving, watching. My stomach tightened. I couldn't make out who or what they were, but there was something unnerving about the way they seemed to hold perfectly still. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I had read too many old ghost stories about this lighthouse after all. I turned back to the view, trying to distract myself, when I heard it, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear what was being said. The words were too soft, too distant, and yet they felt closer than they should have been. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I shined it into the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing. Still, the whisper persisted, growing louder. Panic began to set in. I had never believed in ghosts, but now, alone atop this desolate lighthouse, I wasn't so sure. The figure from earlier was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It felt like something was breathing down my neck. I began to make my way back down the stairs, the flashlight trembling in my grip. With each creak of the old wood, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down harder. The whispers didn't stop, but now they seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. By the time I reached the bottom, my legs were shaking, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The door I had entered through loomed ahead, the only way out. I tried to turn the handle, but it was stuck. I yanked at it, heart racing, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I realized something had locked me inside. Panic surged through me. I spun around trying to find another way out, but the only way was up. The whispers had grown into screams now, echoing through the narrow corridors, but there was no one there. I stumbled back toward the staircase, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a lifeline. I kept climbing, each step feeling heavier, each echo more deafening. It was only when I reached the top that I saw them again, the figure from earlier. They were inside now, standing at the base of the staircase, staring up at me. Their face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. There was no escape. I didn't scream. I didn't move. All I could do was watch as they began to ascend, their movements slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes, staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore an old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The park had been closed for decades, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by everyone. The faded, crumbling entrance sign seemed to scream out to us, promising something eerie and unknown. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. We wandered down the cracked paths, past the rusting remnants of broken rides. The Ferris wheel stood towering, skeletal and empty. Everything felt frozen in time, silent, lifeless, and oddly oppressive. No laughter or music from forgotten years echoed through the park, only the distant creak of old metal and the occasional rustling of leaves. We kept moving deeper into the park, unsure of what we were hoping to find. It wasn't the typical thrill of the unknown. It felt darker. As we approached the old carousel, I noticed something odd. The wooden horses weren't just decaying. They seemed to have faces carved into them, hollow eyes, twisted grins. I instinctively stepped back, my pulse quickening. "What the hell is this?" someone whispered. We tried to laugh it off, but the unease was settling in too deeply. There were too many strange details, small things we couldn't ignore. The once bright colors of the rides had faded into drab, muted hues, and the air felt dense, as though it was pressing in on us. At one point, we came across an old photo booth. It was the only thing still relatively intact. The curtain was tattered, flapping in the wind, and the once vivid pictures printed from the machine were scattered across the floor. I bent down to pick one up, an image of a family smiling, frozen in time. But something wasn't right. The smiles were crooked, their eyes staring past the camera as if they were looking at something we couldn't see. Something about that photo sent a chill down my spine. I looked up, expecting to see my friends, but they had wandered off, further into the park. I hesitated for a moment before following them, clutching the photograph tightly. The deeper we went, the more things began to feel off. The sounds we had heard earlier, the creaking, the wind, began to shift into something unnatural. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves anymore, it was the faint, distant sound of laughter, but it wasn't coming from us. The laughter seemed to come from the depths of the park, distorted and hollow, echoing in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It felt like it was all around us, but we couldn't see a source. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us dared to speak. We eventually found ourselves near the old roller coaster, once grand, now rotted and skeletal. The metal rails were twisted, dangling in midair like broken teeth. Below it, there was an old wooden bench covered in mold. A single flicker of something caught my eye, a small faded envelope resting on the bench. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and picked it up. It was sealed shut, but the paper was worn and fragile. I opened it carefully, revealing a single faded photograph inside. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same photo booth picture I had found earlier, a family frozen in time, but this one was different. The figures were closer and their eyes weren't lifeless anymore. They were watching me, staring directly at me. Through the picture, as if they knew I had it, I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I glanced up, heart racing, and realized the laughter had stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Suddenly, my friends were screaming from deeper within the park. "Run!" someone shouted. "Get out of here!" I didn't think twice. I shoved the photo back into the envelope and bolted, my legs pumping as the distant cries of my friends echoed in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the entrance of the park. The moment I stepped onto the pavement, the air seemed lighter, but my heart was still pounding. I didn't dare look back. That night, back home, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The photo was still clutched tightly in my hand, the faces of the family still watching. I haven't been able to bring myself to throw it away. Whatever was out there in that park, whatever was left behind, it's still following me. I can feel it. And every night, I wonder if it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. It was late summer, and I decided to take a day off to explore the old abandoned amusement park. No one had been there in years, and the place had become a local legend. I remember hearing whispers about it being haunted, but I always dismissed those tales as just folklore. The park sat just a few miles from town, hidden between the trees, its entrance overgrown with weeds and ivy. When I arrived, the sight of rusting roller coasters and decayed ticket booths sent a chill through me. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to dull grays and greens. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making your own breathing feel too loud. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. I began exploring, walking through the empty park, my footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. There was a sense of emptiness so profound, it felt as if the park itself was holding its breath. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the park had been waiting for someone like me to come back. The longer I wandered, the more unsettling it became. The rides loomed above, their rusted tracks creaking softly in the wind. I passed the old Ferris wheel, its once bright lights now dull and flickering weakly. The carousel had lost its once lively tunes, now reduced to the faintest of echoes. I decided to check out the haunted house ride, the most infamous attraction. The faded sign above the entrance read, "Dark Carnival." I hesitated, standing at the entrance, my heart thudding in my chest. The thought of venturing inside made my stomach churn, but curiosity won out. I stepped inside. The first few steps felt normal enough, but as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and the silence became more oppressive. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, shifting in ways they shouldn't. I could hear distant whispers, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. At one point, I came to a part of the ride where mirrors used to reflect the illusion of endless hallways. But, instead of reflections, I saw something far more disturbing. Shadows that stretched and writhed as if they were alive. My breath hitched, and I quickly turned away, my pulse racing. The further I explored, the more the whispers became distinct. They weren't voices, but something far more sinister. Low, echoing murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The walls around me seemed to pulse faintly, as if the place itself was alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled forward and fell, landing hard. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw something on the floor. A black handprint, impossibly large as if made by something inhuman. My stomach twisted as I realized the prints led deeper into the maze of the haunted house. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The shadows felt closer now, watching, waiting. I pressed on, hearing the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever was there was feeding off my fear. Finally, I emerged from the dark maze and found myself back in the open air, beneath the pale light of the moon. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the feeling of being followed didn't fade. I glanced back toward the entrance of the haunted house. The whispers were now louder, as if they were surrounding me. Then I saw it, a figure standing motionless by the entrance, its face obscured by shadows. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed faintly, a faint, otherworldly light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the exit, every step feeling like it might be my last. The figure didn't follow, but I could still hear the whispers in my ears, clearer than ever. The next morning, I drove past the park on my way home. The place seemed just as desolate as before, but something felt different. The whispers still echoed in my head, and I swear I could hear them even now, as if whatever I encountered had found a way into my mind, and I could never escape it. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. It was a calm evening when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the beach. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sand as we arrived. We parked near the shore, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. There were only a few scattered families and a couple of couples enjoying the evening, but the vast beach felt almost empty. The horizon stretched endlessly, the ocean in front of us glowing with the fading light of the day. We set up a small bonfire, sitting on the warm sand, the flames flickering and casting dancing shadows. The sound of the waves was soothing, and the cool breeze carried the smell of the sea. For a while, everything felt perfect. It was one of those simple moments you cherish. Good company, good weather, and nothing but the vast ocean around you. As the night deepened, we got lost in conversation, laughing and sharing stories. Time slipped away. At some point, I noticed the others had fallen into a comfortable silence, gazing out at the water. I turned to look at them, but something felt off. The ocean was unusually quiet. There was no typical hum of waves crashing against the shore, no seagulls squawking. It felt still, as though the entire beach had been frozen in time. I got up and walked to the edge of the water, the sand cooling beneath my feet. The horizon stretched endlessly, the darkening sky blending with the sea. But that silence, it gnawed at me, crawling under my skin. A faint glow emerged from the water, far out beyond the waves. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the moon, but the light wasn't reflecting off the surface. It was coming from beneath it. A pulse, rhythmic and slow, like a heartbeat. I called out to my friends, but no sound came from my mouth. I turned around to them, but they weren't there anymore. I was alone. Panic set in as I turned back to the ocean. The glow was closer now, stretching closer to the surface. I could see it more clearly, an unnatural, eerie light that seemed to come from something below. A figure emerged from the water, pale and translucent. Its face was obscured, its body skeletal, almost ghost-like. It didn't move like a living thing. It glided toward me with a slow, unsettling grace, the light from beneath its form illuminating the dark waters. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to look away. The creature came closer, and I could feel its presence invading my mind, as if it had seen straight through me. The air was thick, and the sound of the waves had vanished entirely. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The figure stopped, its shadow stretching toward me. But it didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel the weight of its gaze, its intent, silent and suffocating. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the water, vanishing without a trace. The ocean returned to its restless state, waves crashing against the shore once more. The sound returned, but it no longer felt familiar. The beach was empty again, and my friends had never been there. I stood there, heart racing, staring at the vast, dark ocean. Alone. Whatever had come from the water was gone, but I knew it hadn't left. It had taken something with it, something I couldn't explain, and I was left wondering if it would ever come back. It was the last day of my trip to the mountains. I had spent the past week hiking, exploring remote trails, and basking in the beauty of nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least during the day. On my final evening, I decided to take one last walk down to a secluded pond deep in the forest. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The trees stretched high above, casting long shadows that made it feel like the world was shrinking around me. The walk to the pond wasn't long, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the isolation, the stillness pressing against my chest. It felt as though the world had been hushed just for me. I reached the pond, which glimmered under the dim light of the stars reflecting off the water. I sat down on a rock, letting out a long breath. As I stared into the still pond, something shifted in the water's surface. A ripple formed, spreading outward in slow waves. I leaned in closer, my reflection breaking apart with each wave. But then something else appeared, something underneath the surface. At first, it looked like just another reflection, distorted by the ripples. But then I saw it. Two pale, lifeless eyes staring back at me from the depths. I stumbled back from the water, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched those eyes slowly rise from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its movements awkward, unnatural. It was pale, its skin wrinkled and damp like it had been submerged for years. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. The figure didn't step fully out of the water. It hovered just above the surface, those hollow eyes still locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me, but its gaze never wavered. I ran, heart racing, lungs burning with every step. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees stretching their branches toward the ground like clawed hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my campsite, my chest heaving. The echo of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I returned to the pond one last time, but there was nothing there, just the still water and the empty forest. Whatever I saw, whatever that thing was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere deep in the shadows of the woods. It was a late afternoon when I found myself walking through an unfamiliar forest. The dense trees stretched endlessly, their branches arching over the narrow trail, casting long, wavering shadows that danced in the fading light. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd gotten lost after taking a wrong turn while hiking alone. My phone had died hours ago, and now the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the forest in an unnatural twilight. My heart pounded as I tried to find a way back, but the trail seemed to have vanished, leaving only a maze of trees and endless undergrowth. As the sky darkened, a chill swept through the trees. I shivered, wishing I'd brought a jacket. The quiet was becoming suffocating, oppressive. Something about it felt wrong. The wind had stopped entirely, and the usual rustling of leaves was replaced by an eerie stillness that felt almost alive. I stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof caved in and windows broken, almost blending into the surrounding woods. It stood as if untouched by time, untouched by human life. I hesitated at the threshold, the memory of horror movies flashing in my mind. But the thought of spending the night out here, lost and alone, was worse. The interior of the cabin was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay scattered, rotting in the corners while cobwebs stretched from wall to wall. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. As I stepped further inside, the feeling of unease intensified, as if I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. I fumbled in my bag, pulling out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim darkness. The shadows around me writhed as I moved, forming distorted shapes on the cracked walls. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, as if someone were standing right beside me, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach twisted, and I swung the flashlight around, scanning the cabin. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, echoing in the hollow space. No answer. I listened closely, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whisper came again, but this time louder, clearer. It was a name, soft but unmistakable. Sarah. I froze. My name wasn't Sarah. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just empty, rotting furniture and the lingering darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the flashlight tighter, wondering if I was imagining things. Sarah. The voice was closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just in my head. It sounded familiar, almost like it was coming from inside my own thoughts. I stumbled toward the door, but as I reached out for the handle, I noticed something. Another whisper, fainter this time, coming from the corner of the cabin. Help. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A presence in the room, as if something was leaning over my shoulder, breathing cold air into my ear. I spun around again, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, repeating over and over again like a loop I couldn't escape. Desperate, I tore through the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but every corner was empty. Every step I took felt heavier, the air more suffocating. Then I heard it, closer than ever. A low, guttural voice right behind me. "Look." I whipped around, the flashlight beam illuminating the figure. But there was nothing, only my distorted reflection on the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. My breath hitched as I realized the reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror had hollow eyes, its face twisted in a sick grin, its mouth moving but no sound coming out. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The air went cold, the forest beyond the cabin silent again. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned back toward the door. As I pushed it open and stepped out into the fading light, I could feel something behind me. The whisper had vanished, but the echo of my name still hung in the air. It wasn't over. I remember the day like it was yesterday, though I wish I could forget it. It was supposed to be an ordinary trip, a simple afternoon drive through the countryside with my wife. We had rented a small, quirky cabin tucked away by a lake, a few hours from home. The idea was to escape the noise of the city and just spend some quiet time by the water. The drive there was uneventful. The winding roads were flanked by endless fields and dense forests. We passed a few scattered towns, but otherwise saw no one. It felt serene, almost like stepping back in time. We arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the landscape. The place was exactly as advertised, isolated, surrounded by towering trees, with the lake just a short walk away. We unpacked, made some tea, and sat on the porch, listening to the birds and the distant hum of insects. By evening, we ventured down to the lake. It was calm, the water reflecting the colors of the sunset. We decided to take a walk along the shore, hand in hand, soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. That's when it started. It began with faint whispers carried on the breeze. I didn't say anything at first, but I felt it, like someone was talking just out of earshot. I glanced at my wife, and I could tell she had heard it too. We stopped and looked around, but there was no one in sight. The whispers continued, growing louder, though the breeze was the only thing disturbing the stillness. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," I replied, trying to keep calm, but my stomach twisted in knots. We decided to turn back toward the cabin. The feeling of being watched had become overwhelming. The whispering followed us, now indistinct, like murmurs too faint to understand. It felt like the trees themselves were watching. Back at the cabin, we locked the door and sat close together on the couch, trying to shake off the sense of unease. The whispers had stopped, but the silence now felt oppressive, as though something was waiting just beyond our perception. Later that night, after we had gone to bed, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. I sat up, straining to hear. The wooden floor creaked under heavy, uneven movement. I nudged my wife awake, and we both listened, our ears pressed to the wall. The footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin as if something was moving around, studying us from the outside. "Is someone out there?" my wife whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry. The steps continued, now sounding closer, more distinct. I could hear breathing now, slow, shallow breaths that didn't belong to any living person. In a desperate attempt to break the tension, I grabbed my phone to call for help. But the screen stayed black. No signal. Nothing. My hands shook as I set it down. Then came a new sound, the knocking. Soft at first, but persistent. The knocks came from the windows, as though something was testing them, probing, searching for a way in. I pressed my back against the bed, the cold wall pressing against my skin. It was like they knew we were there. The knocking grew louder, more aggressive. The whispers returned, but this time they were right outside. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was as though whatever was out there was trying to tell us something. Something we couldn't hear, something we couldn't comprehend. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped as abruptly as they had started. The silence that followed was almost worse. My wife and I sat motionless, afraid to move. Eventually, we must have drifted back to sleep, though the unease lingered with us. In the morning, there was nothing. No trace of anyone or anything. The lake was calm, the trees stood still, and the whispers had faded with the night. But I know what I heard, what we both experienced. And even now, when I think about it, I feel the weight of those moments, of something that wasn't meant to be there, something that was watching, waiting. I never understood what it was, and I hope I never have to again. It was an early spring day, and I was driving alone on a remote country road. The landscape stretched out around me, fields of tall, golden grass swaying gently in the breeze. The road twisted and turned through empty stretches of land, the occasional farmhouse appearing in the distance before disappearing again. I wasn't in any rush. It had been a long week, and I figured a quiet drive was just what I needed to clear my head. My car's engine hummed softly, and the only sounds were the tires on the road and the occasional chirping of birds. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, another farmhouse far off in the distance. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a farmhouse at all. It was an old, wooden structure, half buried in weeds and overgrown trees. The roof was caved in, windows shattered, and the whole thing seemed to lean at a strange angle, like it had been there for decades, forgotten by time. I slowed down, curiosity getting the better of me. The building didn't look like it had been lived in for a long, long time, but there was something unsettling about its quiet, abandoned state. I figured it must have been some sort of barn at one point, but now it was just a hollow shell of what it used to be. I parked the car a few hundred feet away and stepped out, the dry earth crunching underfoot. The wind stirred the trees, making them creak softly. I approached the old structure cautiously, my footsteps slowing as I took in the eerie silence. When I got to the door, I pushed it open gently. Dust and cobwebs hung in the air, and the stench of decay was thick. It smelled like something had died in there and never been removed. My flashlight flickered to life, casting long shadows across the interior. Inside, the place was a mess. Rotting beams, broken furniture, and scattered debris. But what caught my attention was something on the far wall, something I hadn't noticed until I moved deeper into the barn. It was a photograph, nailed crookedly to the wood. The image was yellowed with age, almost too faded to make out, but I could tell it depicted a family, 2 parents and 3 children, standing in front of the barn with smiles frozen on their faces. My stomach twisted. I hadn't expected to find anything like this. The faces in the photograph looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen them before. I glanced around the room, running my flashlight beam over the clutter. That's when I noticed more photos, dozens of them. Old family portraits, wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, all of them nailed to the walls. The people in the photos seemed to watch me, their smiles distorted, eyes fixed on something just beyond the frame. The air grew colder, and I felt the weight of their gaze pressing down on me. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I tore my eyes away from the photographs. My light flickered again, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched unnaturally. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, soft, almost inaudible, like someone was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time, like a breath in my ear. My heart pounded as I slowly turned back to the photos. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The people in the photographs weren't just staring at me, they were moving. Ever so slightly, their faces contorted, their expressions shifting from smiles to something darker. The eyes that had once looked joyful now seemed hollow, empty, as if they were gazing at something beyond the frame. The shadows in the room deepened, and I realized they weren't shadows at all. They were moving, like they were stepping out from the photographs. Panic surged through me as I bolted for the door. My flashlight flickered, casting strange, flickering shadows across the doorway. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me from all sides, their faint murmurs growing into distorted echoes. I didn't look back. I sprinted to my car, heart racing, and slammed the door shut behind me. As I sped away down the empty road, I could still feel those hollow eyes staring at me from inside the barn. I don't know who or what they were, or why they were trapped in those photos, but I'm sure of one thing. They're still there, waiting. The night of the power outage was supposed to be like any other. I had decided to visit the nearby park for an evening walk, something I did regularly to clear my head. The park was large, surrounded by woods, and during the day it was a peaceful place, but at night it took on a different feel, isolated, mysterious. It was around 10 p.m. when I arrived. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my feet. The park was completely empty, not a single light from any street lamp or building. The power had gone out in the entire area earlier that evening, casting everything in deep, unnatural darkness. I didn't mind the quiet at first. In fact, it felt kind of serene. I continued walking down the main trail, the stars above me barely illuminating the path. It was peaceful, but something about the absence of light made the woods feel heavier, more oppressive. The trees loomed closer, casting long distorted shadows that shifted with the breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A chill ran down my spine as I stopped and glanced around. The park was vast, stretching farther than I could see in the darkness. I told myself to stop being paranoid, but the silence was so complete it felt as though something was watching, waiting. I had no phone service, no way to call for help if anything went wrong. I picked up my pace, walking faster. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the woods seemed to close in more with each step. That's when I heard it, the sound of faint rustling behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows stretching endlessly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No response. I listened harder, straining my ears, but the only thing I could hear was the wind whispering through the branches. I continued walking, nerves frayed. The trail twisted and turned, and soon I found myself farther from where I had entered. The forest seemed to grow denser, darker. I couldn't see the path anymore, the trees too thick. I stopped, realizing I was lost. Panic set in. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but the trail behind me had vanished. It was as though the woods had swallowed it whole. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, as though something was lurking just beyond my vision, unseen but present. I tightened my jacket around me and forced myself to breathe, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Then I heard it again, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like my name. I froze. My stomach twisted and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but something told me otherwise. My name echoed once more, softer this time, as though the air itself was speaking it. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaky. No response. My heart pounded louder now, a deafening rhythm in the stillness. The whisper came again, closer this time, so close I could feel it brushing against my ear. I stumbled backward, bumping into something solid, something that shouldn't have been there. I spun around and froze. In front of me stood a figure, draped in what looked like tattered, flowing fabric. Its face was hollow, devoid of features, and its eyes gleamed faintly with an otherworldly light. It was taller than any person, and its presence felt ancient, unnatural. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure took a slow step forward, and I realized it wasn't walking. It glided, as though floating just above the ground. The woods seemed to press in around me, closing tighter, until there was nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice, low and hollow. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around again, but there was no one there. The figure had vanished. I stood there trembling, my mind unable to comprehend what I had just seen. I turned and stumbled away from the spot, not looking back. The woods seemed endless, but somehow I found my way back to the edge of the park. By the time I made it home, the sun was beginning to rise. I never went back to that park again. I'll never forget the night it happened. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything strange, just an ordinary apartment complex on the outskirts of town. My roommate, Anna, and I had lived there for about a year, always keeping to ourselves, never believing in anything supernatural. That night, I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone while Anna had already gone to bed. The building was quiet, except for the faint sound of creaking floors as people moved around in neighboring apartments. I didn't think much of it until I heard something coming from inside my closet. At first, I assumed it was just the usual settling of the building, old pipes, settling walls, creaking floorboards. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting inside the closet, dragging something along the floor. I set my phone down and sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the closet, from deep within. My pulse quickened as I imagined what could be inside. I stood up, my feet making soft thuds on the worn carpet, and walked toward the closet. The door creaked open as I pulled it back. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't what I saw. Nothing but old clothes and random boxes stacked in the corner. I sighed, relieved but still uneasy, and pulled the closet door shut again. As I turned to head back to bed, something caught my eye. A faint shadow flickering at the edge of the doorframe. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the shadow lingered, unmoving. I wanted to dismiss it, but something wasn't right. Slowly, I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. I reached out and touched the doorframe, but there was nothing there. Then, from inside the apartment came a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. "Let me out." I spun around, my breath catching. The whisper had come from the direction of the closet, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look back at the closet door. It was still shut, but I could feel the presence of whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Let me out." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My legs moved involuntarily toward the closet. I wasn't in control anymore, as if something had taken over my body. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to process what I was hearing. Then, with a burst of courage I didn't know I had, I threw open the closet door. Nothing, just empty clothes and old boxes. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared into the abyss of the dark closet. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, like someone, or something, was watching me from within. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the closet. The whisper was still there, though it had softened like it was retreating but not quite gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every shuffle of a neighbor in the hall, felt like it was pointing right to me. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look inside the closet again. I told Anna what happened, but she didn't believe me. Still, that night, and every night after, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, "Let me out." It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon at home, the kind of day when the world slows down and you finally have a chance to relax, the kind of day you take for granted, never expecting anything unusual to happen. I live alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. It's nothing fancy, just a cramped place with thin walls and old wooden floors that creak underfoot. Most of my neighbors are long gone, or at least that's what it felt like. The quiet was almost deafening, only broken by the occasional car passing by on the distant road. That day, I decided to stay in and watch some old movies, something to distract me from the creeping sense of boredom. Around 3 p.m., I popped a DVD into the player and sank into the worn-out couch. The room was dim, the sunlight filtering through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. For a while, it was peaceful. I was lost in the flickering images on the screen when something made me glance toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The street outside was still. No cars, no pedestrians. Just that unrelenting silence. But then, a faint movement caught my eye. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker at the edge of the glass. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. A figure. It wasn't standing still. No, it was shifting, pacing. Something tall and thin, too thin. Its form seemed distorted, almost like it wasn't fully there. The more I stared, the more I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't human. I wasn't even sure it was real. My gut told me to look away, but I couldn't. I was locked in place, unable to move, the figure growing clearer with each passing second. Its face, if it had one, was blank. Just an empty expanse where eyes should have been. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe. Then it tilted its head toward me, as if it could sense my gaze. My pulse quickened. I felt exposed, like it could see right through me. I wanted to look away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I felt paralyzed by some invisible force. The figure raised one long, spindly arm, its fingers dragging against the glass. I could hear the faint scratch like nails on a chalkboard, but it wasn't loud. It was almost whispered. The sound reverberated in my head, filling the room with a sense of unbearable dread. Tears stung my eyes, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure moved closer to the window, its form bending, folding in strange, unnatural ways. Its steps were slow, deliberate, as if it were studying me. The closer it got, the less it resembled anything human. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. Its head tilted even farther, as if inspecting me from afar. I could feel its gaze burrowing into my soul. It didn't blink, didn't move. Time seemed to stretch. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling. The silence in the room had become oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Then it spoke, or rather, it didn't. I heard no words, no sound at all, but somehow I understood what it was saying. The message was clear. You can't escape. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The figure didn't need to speak. It wasn't just standing there. It had crossed over somehow, into my world. It knew I couldn't run. I could feel its presence in my very bones, a suffocating, malignant force that had no intention of leaving. I knew, without a doubt, that it was watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. Eventually, the figure retreated, vanishing into the shadows. The silence remained, but the sense of its presence lingered, like a breath on my neck. I never saw it again, but I know it's still there, waiting. The day started like any other. I had been hiking on a trail deep in the mountains, a place I had visited countless times before. It was my usual escape, a chance to clear my head and breathe in the crisp mountain air. But something felt different that day, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to step further in. The trail twisted through towering trees, their branches arching over the path like ancient sentinels. I had always loved this trail. Its solitude, the sense of being far from the noise of the world. It was peaceful, or so I thought. I hiked for hours, the sound of my footsteps crunching beneath the dry leaves the only company. By midday, the sunlight had started to filter through the canopy, creating long, shifting shadows that danced along the forest floor. I paused, taking a swig of water from my bottle and looking around. The trees were older now, their trunks gnarled and thick, as though they had stood there for centuries untouched. That's when I heard it. A faint whispering, almost like the wind. But there was no wind. It came from deeper within the woods, soft and almost melodic. I strained to hear, but the whispering faded before I could make out any words. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the quiet. But the whispering returned, this time louder, closer. It wasn't the wind, and now I was certain I wasn't alone. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I found myself moving cautiously, following the sound, though every instinct in me screamed to turn back. As I pressed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in. The air grew colder, almost as if the forest itself was watching. My breath came in short bursts, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispering had grown to a near silence, like something was speaking just out of reach, a voice that wanted to be heard but never could be. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but there, standing between two trees, was a figure. It wasn't tall, nor did it move like a human. Its shape was indistinct, like a mass of shadows pulled together. It seemed to be watching me, though its eyes, if it even had eyes, were dark, hollow voids. Fear tightened my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, unmoving, like it had been waiting for me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away. Then the whispering returned, more distinct this time. It wasn't words, but something deeper, something primal and ancient. The figure began to shift, its shape contorting and stretching in unnatural ways. It wasn't human, I knew that much, but it wasn't entirely creature either. Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the whispering, growing louder now, almost deafening. My head throbbed, the sound reverberating in my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but when I opened them again, the figure was closer. Its shadowy form had shifted again, growing darker, more defined. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I fell, the rough ground scraping against my palms. I looked up, expecting to see the figure looming over me, but it was gone. The whispering faded, leaving only the sound of my own breath. Breathing heavily, I scrambled to my feet, my hands still trembling. I didn't dare look back as I made my way out of the woods. The trees seemed to watch me as I passed, their branches creaking, as if they knew I had been there. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I stopped. I turned to look back at the forest, but all I saw was the quiet, empty trees. The figure was gone, the whispering had vanished, but the feeling of being followed, watched, lingered. I never returned to that trail. Whatever had been waiting for me in those woods, I knew I could never escape it. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear the faint whispering, as if it's calling to me from the edge of the trees. It was a quiet night at the old cinema. I was the only one working, the projectionist. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The theater itself was a relic, built decades ago with worn-out seats and a projector that creaked like an old ship. The movies were rarely popular anymore, but the few people who still came were loyal, regulars who didn't seem to mind the dust and the dim lighting. I liked the quiet, the solitude. But tonight, something felt off. The last showing had ended hours ago, and now I was in the projection room, staring at the faint glow of the reel spinning. I was about to shut down the projector when I heard it, the faintest noise. A whisper, almost too soft to hear, coming from the hall below. I froze, listening. The theater had been empty for hours, or at least I thought it had. The whisper wasn't just in my head, it was real, distinct. It came again, a voice barely above a breath. "Help." I leaned closer to the edge of the projection room, peering down into the darkness. The hall was still. Nothing. My heart raced as I hesitated, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help. Please." It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it wasn't from the films either. It wasn't part of the stories on screen. My breath caught in my throat, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I descended the stairs slowly, every step echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers continued, now more distinct. "I'm here. Please." I reached the main floor of the theater. The screen flickered faintly, casting long shadows in the dim light. The chairs were empty, just as they had been when the last film ended. Yet, the whispers came from the seats, as if someone, something, was sitting there. I moved cautiously toward the source of the voice. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the darkness. The whispers became clearer, more desperate. I can't get out." I turned my head, scanning the rows of seats, but saw no one. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. They were coming from beneath one of the seats. Trembling, I knelt down and lifted the seat. Beneath it, there was nothing, only the cold, bare floor. But the whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears as if they had no source at all. Panic gripped me. I wanted to run, but something held me in place, rooted to the spot. The whispers didn't stop. "Help. Please." Then, suddenly, there was silence, complete and oppressive. My heart was hammering, and I clutched my chest, wondering if I'd imagined it all. That's when I saw it. A faint outline of a figure on the far side of the theater, barely illuminated by the screen. It was a shape, taller than a person, its form blending with the shadows. No face, just an empty void where eyes should be. Before I could react, the figure moved closer, drifting silently across the room. It didn't walk. It glided, like smoke being pulled through the air. My breath caught again, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against something cold. I turned, only to find an empty row of seats behind me. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The theater was still empty. The screen blinked, casting distorted reflections of the room onto itself, but the whispers had stopped. I didn't stay long after that. I locked up and left, never looking back. I never heard those whispers again. It started as an ordinary weekend trip with a few friends. We'd decided to go hiking on a trail deep in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but the online reviews promised breathtaking views and quiet solitude, far from the noise of city life. The plan was simple. Hike during the day, camp overnight, and return refreshed. But something about that trail didn't feel right from the start. The first few miles were beautiful. The air was crisp, the forest thick with towering pines, and the only sounds were birdsong and the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. We stopped often, marveling at the view as we climbed higher. The trail was marked clearly, and there were no other hikers around, which wasn't unusual given how secluded the place was. By midday, we were deep into the forest, far from any sign of civilization. It wasn't until we reached the fork in the trail that things started to feel strange. The sign was old and faded, barely legible. One path led to the summit, the other to a clearing near a river. We debated for a bit but decided to head toward the clearing. Something about the summit felt off. The clearing was beautiful. We set up camp there, unpacking our gear and gathering wood for a fire. The river ran nearby, its gentle sound soothing in the quiet. We were tired from the hike and settled into the camp, enjoying the peace and solitude. That night, around midnight, something woke me. It wasn't a sound, it was more like a shift in the atmosphere. The air had become heavier and the forest felt still, too still. I lay there, heart racing, listening. At first, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps. They weren't human footsteps. They were lighter, quicker, and moving in circles around our camp. I sat up, freezing, trying to make sense of the noise. The others were asleep, unaware of what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. Just shadows moving beyond the reach of the beam. I stood, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal. But as I scanned the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't driven by instinct. It was watching us. The footsteps grew closer, slower. They circled the camp like something was observing us from the trees. I could hear breathing, shallow and raspy, echoing through the stillness. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I backed away from the tent. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to make my blood run cold. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, they glowed faintly, like dull embers. It didn't move, didn't approach, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stumbled backward, trying to wake my friends. My voice was hoarse as I called out, but they didn't stir. The figure remained, unmoving, as if frozen in place. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. My hands shook as I tried to think of what to do. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees. There were no shadows. Everything was bathed in a dim, unnatural light. The forest wasn't as dark as it should have been. The figure moved slightly, almost as if it had heard me, its silhouette more defined now. I didn't wait. Grabbing my pack, I ran for the river, heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my own footsteps echoed through the stillness, but I didn't dare look back. I followed the river, trying to escape whatever was behind me. Hours later, I stumbled into a small town, miles away from the trail. My clothes were torn, my legs scratched from running through the woods. I collapsed at the first building I saw, an old gas station, battered and out of breath. The clerk at the counter looked at me confused. "What happened?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty space. I wanted to explain, to tell him about the figure, the footsteps, the silence. But no words would come. I never went back to the mountains, never hiked another trail. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple evening drive. The kind of drive that takes you out of the city and into the quiet, unfamiliar outskirts where there's nothing but endless fields and trees stretching out to the horizon. I had always enjoyed these drives, away from the noise, away from everything familiar. That night, I decided to take the back roads, hoping to clear my mind after a long day. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in shades of purple and orange. The road stretched before me, winding through rolling hills and fields that seemed to go on forever. For the first hour, everything felt peaceful. The radio played softly, the hum of the car was steady beneath me. But then, something shifted. The air seemed to grow colder, and I noticed that the horizon wasn't as far away as it once had been. The trees grew thicker, their shadows stretching across the road like dark sentinels watching me. I didn't think much of it at first, just the usual unease that comes with driving alone at night. But as I continued down the road, I started to notice strange shapes, figures standing still in the fields. They looked like people, but they didn't move, just standing there, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe they were just trees or scarecrows someone had placed out there. But the longer I drove, the more certain I became that they weren't. These shapes were too still, too human. My heart began to race as I passed one of them. It was a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was too far away to see any features, but I could feel its gaze as though it were right beside me. Just shadows, I whispered to myself, my hands tightening on the wheel. But then, something changed. One of the figures moved, just a twitch of its head, too subtle to be human. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My eyes were locked on the figure as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. It was closer now, and I could see more clearly. A tall, thin shape, too long in its limbs, too unnatural in its stillness. Panic surged through me. I wanted to turn around, to get out of there, but my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure. It took another step, its motion almost gliding like it wasn't walking but floating. Suddenly, more of them appeared. From the fields, from the woods, figures, countless figures, all standing silently. Their shapes were indistinct, but they all seemed to watch me with those impossible, still, hollow eyes. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The car felt too small, too confined. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was like they were closing in, stretching out across the empty landscape. Then, without warning, they began to advance. Step by step, they moved in sync, like a silent wave. They didn't run, they didn't scream. They just walked. I couldn't stay there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no rational explanation for this. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I slammed the car into reverse and sped back the way I came. The figures didn't chase me, but I could feel them still there, standing in the darkness, unmoving but ever present. When I finally reached the edge of the strange, endless fields, I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was home, locked in my room, the world outside seeming distant and foreign. To this day, I don't know what those figures were. Were they real? Were they something I imagined in my panic? All I know is that they were there, waiting, and they are still out there, somewhere. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence. The absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse. It was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea. It felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out. But the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it, or if I was the only one who ever would. It was a bright, crisp autumn day when I decided to take a long drive out to the old orchard. My family had owned the farm for generations, and though most of the land had been sold off years ago, a small section of the orchard still remained untouched. I figured it would be a nice escape, a chance to walk among the ancient trees and clear my head. The old farmhouse stood at the edge of the orchard, weathered and forgotten. It wasn't much more than a shell these days, just some broken windows, faded paint, and a few scattered remnants of what had once been a thriving farm. I parked my car near the gravel road and made my way down the overgrown path toward the trees. The air was crisp and sharp, the smell of fallen leaves filling my nose. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers toward the sky. They had been planted long before I was born, and now they stood as silent witnesses to the passing of time. I wandered deeper into the orchard, my footsteps crunching over the leaves that blanketed the ground. The silence here was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of branches or the distant call of a crow. I didn't feel afraid, just disconnected, like I was stepping into a memory that wasn't mine. After a while, I sat down under one of the trees, leaning back against the rough bark. The sun was beginning to dip lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of trees. I closed my eyes for a moment, soaking in the stillness. That's when I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, distant but unmistakable. My eyes snapped open and I strained to listen. The orchard was vast and empty, but the sound was there, just beyond the reach of my sight. It wasn't the wind or some natural noise. It was someone walking through the trees, slow and measured. I stood up, my stomach tightening, and began to walk toward the sound. The footsteps didn't stop, but they never seemed to get any closer either. I kept walking, trying to pinpoint their origin, but the trees twisted and stretched, concealing any clear view. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees. A shape, tall and thin, moving just at the edge of my vision. I stopped, heart racing, and the figure seemed to pause as well. It tilted its head in my direction, and I could see its outline against the fading light. But there was something off about it, a sense of wrongness. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I could feel my breath quickening. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its features were too blurred, too indistinct, as though it were more shadow than flesh. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The figure seemed to drift closer, becoming more solid with each step, yet still somehow not quite there. A chill ran down my spine and I turned to run. My feet pounded against the ground as I pushed through the undergrowth, the sound of the footsteps behind me growing louder, closer. I could feel its presence gaining on me, breathing down my neck. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the orchard where my car was parked. I fumbled for my keys, heart pounding as I threw the door open and climbed inside. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but I knew it was still out there, waiting. As I drove away from the old orchard, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall, shadowy figure following me. It never appeared, but the feeling of being watched never left. To this day, I can't shake the sense that something still lingers there, among those twisted trees, something waiting for me to return. I've always loved the quiet of the night. There's something about the stillness that feels peaceful, calming. A few months ago, I took a spontaneous trip to an old abandoned lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. It wasn't a typical tourist spot, more of a forgotten relic. The lighthouse had been decommissioned years ago, left to crumble under the weight of time and the sea breeze. My friends had backed out, calling the idea too weird, but I was drawn to the solitude. I set out around sunset, carrying only a flashlight and a small backpack with a few essentials. The hike to the lighthouse was long, winding along cliffs that dropped off into the endless ocean below. As I climbed higher, the world seemed to shrink, the noises of civilization fading away. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of pink and orange across the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, night had fully taken hold. The structure was towering and silent, its paint chipped and its windows broken. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. It felt like stepping back in time, a place that had been abandoned long before I'd arrived. Inside the lighthouse was just as I imagined, cold and damp, with old wooden beams groaning under the weight of neglect. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. I climbed up the narrow spiral staircase to the top, each creak of the old wooden steps echoing in the empty tower. At the top, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out in every direction, the moonlight casting a silver sheen over the waves. I settled in on the edge of the platform, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. The silence was almost deafening. There was no wind, no crashing waves, just stillness. I was about to close my eyes when I heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but not quite. I froze. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. Another cry followed, closer this time. My heart started to race. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it felt close. The sound was strange, almost like a mix of a scream and a moan, drifting up from the base of the lighthouse. I climbed down the stairs slowly, every creak echoing louder than before. I kept my flashlight aimed down, scanning the shadows as I went. The sound seemed to be coming from below, beneath the lighthouse. It wasn't an animal, not the wind. It was something else entirely. When I reached the bottom, the cries had stopped. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I walked around the structure, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The silence returned, almost suffocating. That's when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Movement. A figure stood just at the edge of the cliff, barely visible in the dark. I squinted, but they didn't move. They were watching, unmoving, just standing there. My breath hitched as I pointed the flashlight toward them. For a moment, I thought it was a person, but there was something off. The figure wasn't human. The light only illuminated their outline, distorted and strange, as if they didn't belong in this world. Panic clawed at me. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I reached the car, my chest heaving with each breath. When I glanced back at the lighthouse, it was silent. The figure was gone. I still don't know what I saw that night. All I know is, I never returned to the lighthouse. Some things are better left untouched, left to the silence and the darkness where they belong. It was a quiet, ordinary Friday night. I worked at a small, local museum, one of those places with dim lighting and long hallways filled with ancient artifacts. The building had a certain charm to it, but by night it felt hollow, lifeless, like the stories of the past were fading into silence. My shift was from midnight to 8 a.m., and most nights were uneventful, just me and the quiet hum of security cameras. That night, everything was routine as usual. I walked through the galleries, checking the displays, making sure everything was locked up tight. The only sounds were the creak of my footsteps and the faint echo of the security system beeping softly. Around 2 a.m., I was in the main hall near the old exhibit on ancient civilizations. The air felt heavy, like it had been pulled from somewhere deep beneath the earth. The lights flickered once, briefly, and then returned to their usual dull glow. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the building settling. I glanced at the case with the ancient pottery, its intricate designs worn from years of dust and time. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the display cases was cracked open, my stomach twisted. These cases were made to be impossible to open without the alarm system triggering. The glass wasn't shattered, it was simply opened, carefully. I approached, my breath quickening. The artifact inside, the ancient stone mask, was gone. In its place was nothing but empty air. I called security immediately, my voice shaky. The line crackled, but no one answered. I wandered through the museum, heart pounding as I checked each exhibit. One by one, I realized others had been tampered with. A display of ancient scrolls was wide open, the texts scattered on the floor. A case housing old coins was now empty. The more I walked, the more I noticed. Every artifact was either disturbed or missing. Panic set in. What was happening? Someone had broken in, but there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of where they'd gone. I turned a corner and froze. The security camera feed on the wall was glitching, the screen flickering wildly. I stared at the screen, my breath catching. The camera wasn't showing the empty hallways it should have been. Instead, I could see something else. In the grainy, distorted feed, I saw figures, tall, shadowy figures walking through the museum. They moved silently like they were gliding rather than walking. Their faces were obscured, but I knew instinctively they were not human. One of them stopped in front of the empty display case where the ancient mask had been. The figure tilted its head as if inspecting the empty space. Then it turned slowly, as though it could feel my gaze, and began walking toward the camera. The screen went black. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. There was no one to call, no one who could help me. I could feel them in the museum, moving through the darkened halls like ghosts. As I stood frozen, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed, I noticed something else. The air was colder now. Colder than it had any right to be, considering the time of year. The faint sound of whispers filled the stillness, voices murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. I wanted to run, but every instinct told me that running wouldn't help. They were already here. I kept walking, trying to find an escape, but everywhere I went, the shadows followed. I realized, too late, that the missing artifacts weren't random. They were gone. Stolen by the figures that had emerged from some forgotten part of the museum. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't from the shadows or from the air. It was behind me, right beside me. Return what was taken. I turned around, but there was nothing there. No one. No sound, except for the whispers, still echoing from the darkness. I didn't know if I was losing my mind, but I knew I couldn't stay. I rushed out of the museum, sprinting into the night, my breath visible in the cold air. The police came later, of course. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone breaking in. The artifacts were never recovered, and the museum remained silent. They assumed someone had broken in and escaped, but I knew the truth. Whatever those things were, whatever had taken the artifacts, they were still there, waiting. I've never gone back to that museum, and I never will. I've always loved the forest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the fresh air, and the quiet that draws me in. So, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, peaceful, serene, just what we needed to escape from the chaos of city life. We packed up our gear, grabbed some supplies, and hiked several miles into the heart of the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves, but the scenery was breathtaking. As we set up camp, I remember how quiet everything felt. No distant sounds of cars, no faint hum of electricity, just us and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around, laughing and enjoying each other's company. I had never felt more at peace. But when we decided to turn in, something shifted. That night, I kept waking up, hearing strange noises just beyond the trees. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. These were softer, quieter sounds, almost like whispers. I brushed them off at first, telling myself it was just the wind, but something about the tone of those whispers felt wrong. Intimate, almost as though they were meant for someone, not just the forest. The second night, things felt different. I couldn't sleep at all. The forest had gone silent. Not the kind of silence you're used to when you're out in nature, but an unnatural, almost oppressive quiet. There wasn't a single sound from any creature. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been drained of all life. At one point, I decided to step out of the tent and check the surroundings. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I shone my flashlight into the woods, expecting to see some critters or movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I called out to my friends, but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw it. Something standing far off, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it didn't move like a human. Its silhouette was dark, almost blending into the night, but the more I stared, the more I felt like its presence was wrong. The air seemed to pulse around it, and I swear I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I froze, my breath hitching. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It didn't seem curious, it didn't feel human, it felt watchful in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed away, slowly retreating into the tent, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but nothing else came. The next morning, my friends were awake, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. They didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the figure in the woods. When I told them, they just shrugged it off, calling me paranoid. I didn't press the issue. We packed up our gear, leaving the quiet forest behind us, still unsure of what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were back in town that I realized something truly terrifying. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. But when I scrolled through my pictures from the trip, I froze at what I found. In the photos from the night before, something appeared. A faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And somehow, whatever it was, it had been watching us. I don't know what it wanted, and I never want to go back to that place. Some things are better left unseen. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail, and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But then, I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. I had always loved taking long drives. There was something peaceful about winding roads and open landscapes, a way to clear my head and escape from the chaos of everyday life. One evening, after a particularly long and stressful week, I decided to take a spontaneous trip out into the countryside. The sun was setting as I pulled onto a narrow, winding road surrounded by forests on either side. The world felt silent, distant, almost untouched by time. I had no destination in mind, just the freedom of the open road. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew darker, stretching long and menacing across the pavement. It was almost as if the forest itself was watching. I had the strange feeling that I was being pulled further into some unseen force. I passed a few old, crumbling signs for landmarks that no longer existed. The further I went, the less familiar everything became. The road twisted and turned, the forest thickening around me, swallowing any sense of direction or familiarity. That's when I saw her. At least, I think it was her. A figure standing motionless by the side of the road. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress, her dark hair hanging over her shoulders. Her eyes were hollow, empty, as she stared straight ahead, not moving. I slowed down as I approached, unable to look away. My heart pounded as I passed by her, but something felt off. I glanced back in my rear-view mirror. She wasn't there anymore. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, empty and desolate. I shook my head, trying to brush off the lingering feeling of unease. Maybe I was imagining things, but something about that figure felt wrong. As I continued driving, I came to a sudden realization. I had no idea where I was. The road had changed. It wasn't just winding anymore. It felt like I was on a loop, repeating the same stretch of forest over and over. My panic grew as I pressed harder on the accelerator, hoping to break free from this endless cycle of trees. Then I noticed something strange. Lights. Not from my car, but from deep within the forest. Flickering, distant, like someone was trying to signal to me. I couldn't stop myself. I followed the faint glow deeper into the woods. The light grew brighter, and soon I could see a figure moving towards me. It wasn't the woman from before. This figure was taller, obscured by the thick shadows, but its eyes seemed to shine like dark pools. The closer I got, the harder it was to focus. The light was almost blinding now, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. The figure stepped into view, and I realized whatever this was wasn't human. Its face was distorted. twisted into something that wasn't quite alive. No features, no expression, just an abyss of darkness where its eyes should have been. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Panic took over, but my body refused to move. I wanted to look away, to turn the car around and drive back, but my gaze was locked on the creature. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure disappeared. The light faded, leaving me in the same endless darkness. I knew I couldn't stay. I spun my car around, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I drove as fast as I could, barely noticing the trees passing by, the landscape a blur of black and gray. Hours later, I found myself back on a familiar highway, far from the forest. My hands still trembled, and the weight of what I had seen pressed heavily on my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I've never gone back to that stretch of road, and I never will. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. The night sky stretched endlessly above the old train tracks. We were out there, just friends on a camping trip, away from everything. No phones, no towns, just the woods and the faint sound of a distant train. It was supposed to be peaceful, a night of campfires, laughter, and staring up at the stars. But everything changed when we stumbled across the old station. We hadn't planned on visiting it. It wasn't on any map, but curiosity led us off the trail. The station had been abandoned for decades, weathered by time and overgrown with vines. The roof had caved in, leaving skeletal beams exposed. It was eerie, but we thought it would make a cool spot to rest for a while. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. The wooden floor groaned underfoot, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like thin curtains. We joked about the ghosts, making light of the old station's dark past, but something didn't feel right. As we wandered deeper into the building, one of my friends, Emily, stopped abruptly, staring at the wall. We all gathered around, shining our flashlights where she pointed. The wall was covered in writing. Scrawled in faded, jagged letters were words that made my blood run cold. "Help us." None of us spoke. We stood there, frozen, as if the very silence around us was pressing down. There were other messages, scratched out beneath, phrases we couldn't make sense of. Words about trains, about waiting, and something else entirely. "They're still coming." That's when the whispers began. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I turned to see if anyone else had heard them, but my friends were motionless, their eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. It felt like they were closing in on us. We bolted from the building, running back toward our campsite, the sound of our footsteps drowned out by the endless rustling of the trees. My chest heaved as we made it back to the clearing, but we couldn't escape what followed. Back at the campfire, we all sat in silence, watching the flickering flames. I kept glancing toward the trees, waiting, expecting to hear something again. But it was the quiet that frightened me the most. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying those words, that feeling of being watched. Even now, I wonder what was meant by those messages, and if they're still out there, waiting. We left the station behind, but the memories of what we saw have never left me. The train is long gone, but I know they're still out there,